Hello everybody and welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, my name is Kailin and I post new videos every single Saturday with a few sprinkled in between. I post videos mainly about eating disorder recovery and intuitive eating, so if that's something that you're interested in, I would love for you to click onto the subscribe button down below and become part of our little family. I think this hood is going to be very distracting. We're going to put it down. Also, every time I wear the sweater, I get questions about it, so I'm going to leave the information for it linked down below. And I think I also have a cheeky 20% discount code for y'all as well. Not sponsored, just wanted to put it out there. So in today's video, we are going to be talking about binge eating, which is a super requested topic for my channel. I'm sure I will make more installments in the future, but today we're going to be talking about what binge eating is, some of the root causes of this specific eating disorder, as well as some tips and tricks on how to stop binge eating. And the reason I felt really compelled to make this video is because everywhere online, I see a lot of misinformation. I see people saying, oh, if you don't want to binge eat, just take a sip of water and go on a walk. No, that's not how it works. And of course, I am not a medical professional. So today's video will definitely be inspired from my own journey with binge eating, as well as research that I've done in order to help some of my clients. I am an eating disorder recovery coach, if you didn't know, and also just some scientific journals that I've read because this is a subject that I am really passionate about and also really interested in. So before we get started, I think that it would be really important to define what binge eating is. And the definition that I'm going to be using is according to the DSM-5, which is the Diagnostic Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, something like that, whatever it's called, I'm going to put it here. One of the biggest indicators of binge eating disorder is a lack of control when you eat. Typically, you are eating a lot of food, so a large quantity of food within a very short period of time. And when we're talking about a lack of control, we're talking about physically being unable to stop, even if you feel like you are about to explode. To be diagnosed with binge eating disorder, you also have to have at least 3 of the 5 following characteristics. You have to be eating a lot faster and more rapidly than normal. You have to be eating until you are uncomfortably full, like physically feeling sick. Eating large amounts of food when you're not physically feeling hungry, eating alone or in secret because you are ashamed or embarrassed about your eating habits, and number 5, feeling disgusted or depressed or very guilty after these binge episodes. And to be diagnosed with binge eating disorder, these episodes have to happen at least once a week for at least 3 months. So now that we've gotten all of that information on the table about what binge eating is, I know that there's a lot of difficulty to separate binge eating from overeating and from extreme hunger. I know that there's a lot of overlap between the 3, and if you do want a separate video all about extreme hunger versus binge eating versus overeating, I am more than happy to make that video if it's something that you would like to see. So if it is, just leave me a comment down below. But I think one of the biggest differences between those 3 and binge eating is really this lack of control, where you feel like it's almost an out-of-body experience and you can't stop no matter how hard you try, no matter how physically full you get. And I can say from my own experience, it's terrifying. And I know a lot of people sometimes have a lot of difficulty separating extreme hunger from binge eating, but extreme hunger is constant hunger, whether that is mental hunger, physical hunger. You can eat a huge meal and then be hungry later. Giving in to that extreme hunger is not binge eating. Extreme hunger is also a primitive response to restriction, and it does not last forever. And though giving into this hunger can feel like a binge, I think that the biggest difference that we're looking for right now is this lack of control, frequency, and just feeling really disgusted with yourself post-binge. And what I find really interesting is that binge eating really is not spoken about on the internet enough, in my opinion. And I find this strange or interesting because binge eating disorder actually affects 3 times the amount of people than anorexia and bulimia combined. It's something that I struggled with for around 5 years, if not more, and I would not wish this disorder upon anybody. It's frustrating and scary, and you feel really hopeless. So if this is something that you're struggling with right now, I just want you to know that there's nothing wrong with you. You haven't failed, you haven't done anything wrong. A lot of the times binging is a trauma response or a response to restriction. We are going to talk about all of that. But before we get into this video, I just want to say that every single eating disorder deserves proper care, yourself included. It doesn't matter if you don't think that you're sick enough. It doesn't matter if you don't have this kind of glamorized version of an eating disorder that is shown all over the media. It doesn't matter. Whatever you are struggling with, you are valid and you are worthy of care, no matter what your body looks like. We're talking about mental illnesses, just to keep that in mind. But when it comes to binge eating disorder, let's loop back. It is really normalized in the society that we live in. And it makes me fucking mad, because we see people having cheat days. So they restrict throughout the week and then they have this big cheat day on Saturday. And I'm sorry to inform you, but that is the binge restrict cycle. You should not have to cheat on your diet. You should not have to cheat on the food that you eat, because all food is good food. And when we start categorizing food as good or bad or healthy or unhealthy, we start moralizing food. And when we start to do that, we feel guilty if we engage with foods that we think are bad. Another way that binge eating is also glamorized are through mukbangs on YouTube. And I'm not talking about people just sitting down and having dinner with a friend or with a pal. I think that's great and a great resource for people who have a lot of trouble eating and who need to eat with people in order to normalize the experience. However, a lot of the mukbangs that you look up that have millions and millions and millions of views, there are people who just are binging live on camera. And that kind of behavior is not okay. And I can do an entire video on mukbangs if that's something that you would like to see. My point being that these kinds of disorders are very glamorized in society and very normalized. So sometimes it can be really difficult to identify with this disorder because of how normalized it is. So you might not even know that you're struggling from binge eating when you are. So the thing about binge eating is that it causes a lot of shame around food. So you could be hiding food, eating in secret, hiding wrappers in the garbage, and also comparing what you eat to other people. It's almost as if you can't shut off a certain part of your brain that hyperfixates on food. So how do people normally develop binge eating disorder? It's a valid question. People want to know. And like many other eating disorders, there's definitely a genetic component. If somebody in your family has suffered from an eating disorder in the past, you are 46 to 72% more likely to develop one yourself. And that's a huge, staggering statistic. The likelihood is so high. Another reason people develop binge eating disorder is because of trauma, abusive relationships, loss of a family member or friend. In a way, binge eating is how you cope with this specific trauma that happened to you. Another possibility of why people struggle with binge eating disorder is perhaps you were in a very body-focused sport when you were younger, like gymnastics, ballet, and also if you've entered bikini competitions or anything like that, the likelihood of you binging after periods of restriction to change your body for an aesthetic goal is very high. And this is because the last reason that I'm going to be mentioning right now that people binge in the first place is because they have a history with dieting or restriction. So there are a bunch of reasons: family, trauma, experience, genetics, restriction and dieting. The list goes on and on. Regardless of how you have ended up at this place, I think a big question that people ask themselves is how to heal, how to get better. And something that I would highly recommend is to be aware of your behaviors. So track when they happen, not what you eat, but when they happen. Are they always at night? Are they always on the weekend? Is it after every time you see a specific person? Be very curious about your day and what happened prior to the binge, and ask questions. Don't be judgmental. We don't need to be judgmental, okay? We just need to be curious. Why did this happen? Were you tired? Were you emotionally drained or feeling a really powerful emotion at the time? Had you eaten enough earlier on in the day? These are all very valid questions, and questions you should ask yourself post-binge instead of trying to beat yourself up and coming up with a plan of what to do after. You should think about what happened before. We never want to allow binges just to happen without questioning how we got there. Try to understand your triggers, try to pinpoint them, and then try to work through them. And for those of you who use binge eating as a coping skill, developing new coping skills is definitely something I highly recommend doing. And if you are curious about what coping skills are, they're basically strategies that can help reduce your stress, and also minimize conflict in your life as well. And I think that it's really important to find coping strategies outside of your body and outside of food. So instead of turning to food, or instead of trying to alter your body or doing some kind of movement, what other coping strategies can you come up with? It'll be different for everyone, but for me, I really like journaling. I really like to create art, whether that's really shitty paintings or expressing myself through writing. It's different every day. And even when you do come up with other coping skills and other coping mechanisms, the urge to binge is probably still going to be on the forefront of your mind. And the reason for this is because binging has become a habitual response to stress, to emotion, to anger, to whatever you are going through at the moment. And it takes a long time for our bodies to acclimate to new coping mechanisms. So just continue to practice and continue to try to find comfort outside of food. And that's not to say that food can't bring us comfort, because it can. But when it comes to binge eating disorder, usually we are punishing our body and hurting ourselves more than actually finding comfort. And coping strategies can also include distraction techniques. So some of my favorite distraction techniques have to do with sensory detail. So trying to name 5 things that I can see, 4 things that I can hear, 3 things that I can touch, 2 things that I can smell, 1 thing that I can taste. Trying to find sensory details is a great way to distract yourself. One of my other favorite distraction techniques is something called categories. And for this, I just think of a random category like animals. And I name as many animals as I can until I hit repeats, and then I change my category again to colors, to books, to movies. The categories are literally endless, which makes the game awesome when it comes to distraction. But if processing the emotion that you are going through right now is too difficult, I think that distraction is a great technique to use as well, as long as you allow a little bit of time for process. Because feeling uncomfortable emotions is uncomfortable, and there's nothing wrong with that. It's okay to be uncomfortable. And so what I want you to try to do is use other coping skills before you turn to food. And just because you know this information, just because you know that you can turn to other coping mechanisms, doesn't mean you will. But I just want you to try your best to practice sitting with your emotions, trying to understand them, trying to be curious and ask questions. It could really go a long way. In my experience from working with my clients, I think that the number 1 reason people binge is because they restrict. It makes sense, right? You don't feed your dog for the entire day, and your dog is super hungry, and then you put them in a room with a bunch of delicious treats. The dog is going to go berserk. It's going to overeat, most likely, feel sick, continue eating past fullness, because it's confused, and its primitive response is to fill up as much as it can, because it doesn't know when it's going to get food next. Because the dog was restricted, they don't know that the next day that they're going to have breakfast, so they're trying to eat as much as possible. And it is really, 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 really rare that I hear that people binge on fruits and vegetables. Of course, it can happen. It's a possibility, but most people binge on foods that they restrict. So oftentimes people are binging on sugar or on carbs because they try to avoid those foods throughout the week, throughout the day, and then nighttime rolls around or the weekend rolls around, and they just can't control themselves around these foods. And instead of blaming their actions, right, so restriction, they blame the foods and basically say, well, I clearly can't control myself around sugar, so I can't have it, because every time I do, I just lose it. And the reason you are losing it is because you are not allowing yourself to have it, not because of the food itself. And a lot of people try to keep binge foods out of the house. Not a good idea. My biggest recommendation is to have all of those binge foods that you normally reach for in your house at all times, to normalize the experience of having them, to not provide any kind of novelty towards them either. When it comes to binge eating, I think it's also really, really important to analyze the relationship that you have with food. Do you view food as good or bad or healthy or unhealthy? Do you tell yourself that you can't have certain foods? If you do, so if you label foods or tell yourself that you can't have them, the likelihood of you desiring these foods has astronomically increased. As human beings, we want what we can't have, always. And if somebody tells you that you can't have something, you are going to want that food more than anything. So let me give you an example, okay? If cookies are something that you binge on, having cookies frequently will normalize the food, take away the novelty, and the chances of you binging on that food will decrease tremendously. So if you have a cookie with every snack, if you have a cookie with every meal, if you have a cookie for dessert after dinner every single night, by the end of the week, you are probably going to be sick of cookies. And that's because they're no longer something that you are restricting, but something that you're having very, very frequently. And the more you eat something, I mean, the chances of you getting sick of that specific food is really, really high, at least for me. We have to remove food from pedestals. And restriction goes way beyond allowing yourself food as well. There are so many forms of mental restriction that I think are also really important to talk about. If you allow binge foods, but only in certain quantities, like you're counting out or portioning it or whatever, that is still a form of restriction. Because you're not eating until you're actually satisfied. You're eating what you think you should be eating, whatever that means. Don't put trust in an online calculator. Put trust in your body. If you are eating something and the entire time you're telling yourself that you are a horrible person, that you are a bad person, you are not setting yourself up for success that way. The way you talk to yourself is so incredibly important, especially when it comes to eating disorder recovery. If you tell yourself that you are a huge failure after you binge eat, you're gonna wanna try to make up for it somehow, but you have nothing to make up for, right? And if you tell yourself that you are a horrible, worthless person because you're eating a specific food, you're gonna associate negative emotions with that food, therefore creating a really weird power dynamic. Food shouldn't have power over you. You are in control of this life, even if it feels like you don't have that kind of control right now. The only way to truly stop the binge restrict cycle is to stop restricting, no matter how difficult it is for you. Show yourself compassion. This shit is hard. Don't make it harder for yourself. You are going to have slip-ups, 100%, especially at the beginning of your journey, and there's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with attempting different coping skills. There's nothing wrong with questioning yourself and not restricting and then still binging. It just means that there are more issues to address. It just means that you have to continue practicing. It just means that you have to continue being compassionate. You can get out of this cycle. I am living proof that it can be done. 5 years, if not more, of my life restricting and binging and crying about it and binging again, and then restricting because I'm trying to be good and going on another diet, and then binging back and forth and back and forth. It's fucking exhausting. You are the only person that can make this stop. And part of that is being aware. That's what we spoke about. Recognizing your triggers, being compassionate to yourself, having different coping skills to go to, being curious, no longer putting food on pedestals or categorizing food as healthy or unhealthy. Some other things that I think can be very, very beneficial when you are suffering from binge eating disorder is to eat regularly. And I'm talking every 3 hours or so. Eat frequently, even if you only feel a little bit hungry, a tiny bit, still eat. You don't have to wait for full-fledged primal hunger to kick in. We feel hunger in very different ways. If you're always thinking about food, you are probably hungry. If you're feeling headachy or have brain fog, also probably hungry. You don't have to feel hunger in your stomach in order to eat. Something else that you can do is make self-care a priority. Don't let that shit slip. And also recognize when you are in the cycle. When you are aware, you are going to be able to recognize the cycle a lot more quickly. And when you do recognize it, you have to do something about it, right? So if you're planning on skipping a meal or skipping a snack, opposite action is what you should do. So you should go make that snack. You should go make that meal. Eating disorder recovery is all about opposite action. So if your mind and your eating disorder voice is screaming at you to go move and burn off the food that you've eaten, the opposite action is to remain still, to be at home. And I'm not saying that this is easy because it's not, but something that is worthwhile isn't just easy. And the last tip that I have for you is to please reach out and work with a professional. You don't have to do this alone, okay? And I know that eating disorders and suffering, it makes you feel super freaking isolated. But there are millions of people in the world who feel the same way that you do, and also millions of people in the world, myself included, who have come out on the other side. It's possible for you too. You are worthy of recovery just as much as anybody else is. So I hope this helped answer some of your questions about binge eating, why it starts, some things that you can do, a little bit about the difference between binge eating and extreme hunger. If you do have any other specific questions that I wasn't able to answer in this video, please leave them in the comments down below or send me a DM over on Instagram, and I would be more than happy to help you and to talk it through, because you are not alone. I am here. As always, thank you so much for watching. I hope you have a wonderful day. Make sure to do something kind for you today, and I can't wait to see you in my next video. Bye guys.